We also have not seen a large or damaging earthquake, really damaging, in a really long time. And so I think people's idea of what could happen is a little bit skewed.
So I know what an earthquake is, but I don't actually understand what's happening. Like the ground is shaking, but what's really kind of going on down there?
That's a great question. And usually, when we think of earthquakes, what we think of is that ground shaking and its impacts. But what's happening? Let's zoom out. So the surface of the Earth has these big tectonic plates that are moving around very slowly. The places where they come together are the places where we have earthquakes. So that's the big driver of earthquakes. That motion is causing uh, differences in the direction that the plates are moving, right? And so those are rocks, and rocks will break. So as these plates are moving, they're causing stress and strain to build up inside those rocks. And eventually you're going to overcome the strength of the rocks and they're going to break. When they break, they send out energy waves in all directions. That system, those energy waves, are the shaking that we feel.
When I kind of imagine it using my hands as an example, you got this plate going this way and this plate going this way, just to simplify it.
Mhm.
But when it shakes, does the whole plate like move or do parts of the stuff?
Oh, I love these questions. So the way it usually works, and this is kind of something people maybe don't know, rocks actually are kind of elastic. They'll bend a little bit before they break. So you have these giant plates that are moving, okay? The places where they come together, you can think of them as being stuck. And so as they're moving, they're deforming, and eventually they're going to break and it's going to snap so that they're sort of meeting the motion of the rest of the plate. So we think about, these plates have moved, say, 9 feet since the last earthquake. So we have 9 feet of motion that has to be taken up in the next earthquake. And so when it breaks, it'll move 9 feet so that the stuck part will catch up with the rest of it.
Is it fairly like uniform as it spreads across, or as this energy moves across, it hits this pocket of ground and does this? It hits this pocket of ground that there's rocks there and it does this.
So what we feel during an earthquake is controlled by different things. So the first thing is the magnitude, which is the amount of energy that's released during an earthquake. And that's controlled in part by the length of the fault that moves and the depth of the fault that moves. So it's a three-dimensional surface below the ground, kind of like you have your hands together and you slide them. That would be like the rocks sliding over that whole surface. And so the longer the fault and the deeper the fault, the larger the magnitude of the earthquake. The larger the magnitude of the earthquake, the more energy that's released and the more shaking people will feel. The second thing that controls what you feel is your distance away from the part of the fault that broke. And so this makes intuitive sense, right? If you're closer to where the fault broke, you're going to feel more shaking. If you're farther away, you're going to feel less shaking. And that's not just map distance, that's also about how deep the earthquake was. So if you have a really deep earthquake, like if it's, 300 kilometers below the surface, the closest people and our infrastructure is 300 kilometers away. But if you have a shallow earthquake, say 8 kilometers below the surface, now people and infrastructure are much closer. The third thing that controls what we feel is our local rock and soil conditions. And that's sort of what you were getting at. So soft sand and soil will shake harder and for a longer period of time than bedrock an equivalent distance away. And you can imagine this like you have a bowl full of jello and you have a piece of granite, and they're both strapped down to a table. And now you shake the table, the jello is going to shake harder than the granite, right? It's going to almost like catch the waves and they'll reverberate around in there. The earth is kind of like that.
Does it help to be softer in any way, in the sense that, like, okay, this is going to shake more, but because there's more give in it, you're going to be a little bit more okay?
No, the soft sands and soils have multiple issues that can happen. The first is that you're going to have amplification of shaking. You're going to shake harder and longer. The second thing is soft sand and soils and a high water table can cause something called liquefaction, which is a secondary effect of earthquake shaking. And that's where the water gets pushed up towards the surface, which causes all the little grains of sand and dirt to be pushed apart. It increases the pore pressure, which causes the surface of the ground to lose strength. That can mean that it spreads, it can crack, it can cause these sort of sand boils, water, flowing up towards the surface, but it can also cause an effect sort of like quicksand. So if you have a structure like a building on top of it, the foundation of the building can actually sink into the ground because the ground has lost its strength.
These plates, are they pretty delicate in the sense that it doesn't take much for them to break, even though we're talking about geological timescales? Or are they like, man, if you break these or they shift, that's a really big deal?
It's a big deal. So where you are in Seattle, you are along the junction between the Pacific plate, no, sorry, the North American plate, which is what most of North America is on, and the Juan de Fuca plate, which is a little small plate that is getting shoved down underneath the North American plate in a subduction zone. That's what those are called. And the subduction zone actually can create the largest earthquakes on Earth because you have a lot of area of the fault that can break, right? In order to break, the ground has to be brittle. But if you subduct it, stick it too far inside the earth, it starts to get warm. So sort of like a chocolate chip cookie that you pull out of the oven. When they're nice and hot, they're gooey and they just bend. Once they're cool, they break. So cold rock breaks, hot rock doesn't. So it's still cold as it's going down. So you have lots of surface area. So you have larger magnitude earthquakes, right? In the Pacific Northwest, it's interesting because you can have earthquakes in multiple places, right? As this plate's going down and it bends, you can have earthquakes as a result of that bending inside that plate. You can have earthquakes along the interface between the two plates. And as this plate is pushing down, it's pushing the other one up. And anytime you cause rocks to bend, you cause them to break.
Is there any way to kind of quantify the amount of energy that we're talking about? Because in my mind, like, the earth is moving. I can't even imagine what that takes to do that.
So we can quantify the amount of energy that's released in earthquakes. Usually we do it like using atomic bombs as the other corollary. We can measure how much the ground is moving using GNSS or GPS stations. So we can tell how much the plates have moved and how quickly they're moving. And we know that places where the plates are moving more quickly are storing up stress and strain, more quickly. And so those are the places that are most likely to have earthquakes. So the plates that are moving the fastest are the ones that tend to have the most earthquakes.
Do all the plates operate relatively the same way? Or is every single one a different interaction and a different circumstance? Or is it kind of like there's this type that goes this way and there's this type that goes that way? Or is it like every single one is going to be different?
There are three main types of plate boundaries, ways that the plates can come together. They can come together, converge, and that's when you get subduction zones, or you get big mountains like the Himalayas. They can pull apart. That's a divergent boundary. That's what's happening along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, for instance. And you can have them sliding past each other. Those are transform or strike-slip boundaries. The most famous strike-slip fault is the San Andreas Fault that runs along most of the length of California. So those are the three main ways that the plates can come together. But all of those have differences. And we spend a lot of time looking for similarities and differences in these different fault systems to try and say, okay, we know this one behaves this way. Can we take that information and apply it to this fault so that we can learn more and be more prepared about what that fault might do?
On a scale of like 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, where do you think we are in kind of our knowledge of earthquakes right now?
It's a hard question. We have a lot to learn, but we also know a lot. I would say we're like a 6 to a 7. But, geologic time is tough, right? Because our human timescale, our whole existence of our species is just a blip on the radar compared to the timescale over which earthquakes and plate tectonics works. So we have to take the observations that we have now and try and apply them into the future while having only a very murky idea of the past.
If you have like once an earthquake happens, does it fundamentally kind of reset the whole system? Like, okay, we know an earthquake generally happens in this area every 200 years, but then the earthquake happens. Are you dealing with an entirely different set of circumstances, or is it just kind of, it happened and it's going to be more of the same as we move forward?
It's more of the second. So the fault over the time frames that we're looking at it, so hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, is going to behave fundamentally the same way. The way we think of it is kind of this characteristic earthquake model, and there's argument about whether or not that's appropriate. And the idea is that you have that stress and strain that builds up until you overload the system too much, then you have an earthquake, and that sort of puts it back at zero. And then it slowly starts to build up through time, and then it'll go again. And then it builds up through time, and then it'll go again. That's not necessarily what we see, and it's not that simple, because every time there's an earthquake on a nearby fault, it changes the stress inside the crust on the other faults that are around it. And so in some places that will reduce the stress and strain, and in other places it'll make it more pronounced and make that fault more likely to fail. So trying to figure out how the stress field inside the earth is changing. And we also don't know after an earthquake whether or not it's released all of the built up stress. Maybe it's sort of like a tea kettle and you just let a little bit of steam off and then it's still pretty close to going again. So we're making assumptions that what we see now is the way it's always been and the way it's going to be in the future. And it's difficult to test that.
How come we can't predict them?
Oh, that's a good question. So in order to predict an earthquake, we have to assume that there is something that happens before the earthquake that we can observe and measure, a precursor to that earthquake. And not only does a precursor have to exist, and we have to be able to measure it, it has to happen before just about every earthquake, right? And so we have been looking for these precursors for a really long time, and we haven't found any. In fact, we drilled down into the San Andreas Fault in an area where there's a lot of microseismicity or really small earthquakes, and we instrumented that whole area deep in the earth to try and catch something that happened before these earthquakes. Is there a change in electricity? Is there a change in pore pressure? Is there a change in heat flow? Is there any kind of change we can measure? And we didn't find anything. Now, does that mean it doesn't exist? I don't know. So is it that we don't have sensitive enough instruments? Could be. Could it be that we don't know what we're looking for? Could be, but maybe it doesn't exist. And so in that case, how are we going to predict something when there's no way to know that it's coming?
Do you think that people are generally prepared? Like how serious do we as people, as governments, as society, like really take these things?
That's a hard question. There's a lot of things that require our attention as individuals, as families, as communities, as governments, right? There's a lot of things happening that we need to deal with every day. Earthquakes are just one of them. And because earthquakes don't happen very often, they tend to fall towards the bottom of the list. But they also are really impactful when they do happen. I would say overall, people on the west coast of the US are relatively earthquake aware. They have a good idea of what to do. They have a relatively good idea of what it might look like to have a big earthquake. And at least in California, there's enough reminders that we live in earthquake country. People are feeling shaking, pretty regularly. Small shaking, but it's like, oh, that's right. Maybe I need to go and get more water. That's right. Maybe I need to make sure that I have extra dog and cat food just in case something happens and the supply chains are interrupted. So could we be more prepared? Absolutely. Do we still have a lot of work to do? Yes, we do. But we have made a lot of strides. We also have not seen a large or damaging earthquake, really damaging, in a really long time. And so I think people's idea of what could happen is a little bit skewed.
Skewed in the sense that we don't think it's going to be as bad, or it's going to be worse?
It falls in two camps, right? So on the one hand, you have the people that watch things like San Andreas with the rock, and they think that it's going to be tidal waves swamping San Francisco and large, huge chunks of the city are going to be like capsizing like the Titanic. Not going to be like that. But then other people are like, especially in California, they're like, psh, I lived through Northridge, it'll be fine. And I'm like, whoa, Northridge was not a big earthquake.
On the Richter scale, like what was Northridge?
It was a 6.7.
So that's, what would you consider to be like, what do people like yourself like, okay, that's big?
Anything over a 6, especially if it's somewhere like the LA Basin, San Francisco, under Seattle, I'm going, ooh, there's going to be some impacts from that. Probably not catastrophic, but there may be some injuries from, especially unreinforced masonry, the like brick facades or brick buildings. Those bricks do not withstand earthquake shaking very well, and so they'll fall. Chimneys will fall, things like that, and people can be injured, and that's important. Once you get into like a 6.5, we start to worry. Once it's a 7, That's bad news, especially if it's in a populated area. But like California had a magnitude 7.1 in 2019 out in the desert, and there were some smaller towns that were impacted in significant ways. But a 7, near Los Angeles and San Diego would be a much bigger deal and have a lot more of a societal impact. So we have these sort of internal clocks about location and magnitude in terms of how damaging we're expecting it to be.
I'm going to ask you the question that I'm going to regret asking. Like I said, I live in Seattle, and they're expecting like this is going to be like a 9, and it's going to be really bad. Is it going to be like, oh man, that's going to be really bad? Oh no.
So, the subduction zone earthquakes are interesting. Remember, we were talking about how the length of the fault and the depth of the fault impacts the magnitude?
Yeah.
To get a magnitude 9 earthquake, you are rupturing a fault that is like 1,000 kilometers long. And so if you think about faults like zippers, because they don't just break all at once, they unzip like a zipper. They start at a point deep inside the earth called the hypocenter. And we can think of that like the actual zipper. And a smaller earthquake would be like unzipping your pants, just zoop, and it's done. And it produces shaking the whole time that it's happening, but then it's over. Imagine now unzipping a sleeping bag and how long that takes. And the whole time that fault is unzipping, it's causing shaking to happen, right? And so you have really a lot of energy that's being released. You have the possibility for really high amounts of shaking and long duration shaking. Those earthquakes, the shaking will last minutes, not seconds. And so high levels of shaking for long periods of time, you have population centers nearby. And the other thing is that subduction zone earthquakes like that can also cause tsunamis because they can cause the seafloor to move upward, and that lifts up the water column above it. The water column then flows out in all directions, and that's the tsunami. So not only do you have this high level of shaking, you also may have secondary effects like tsunamis that are going to cause additional damage.
It's a big deal, right? Like, and I know that for my family, we have stockpiles. We've got food. We've got water. We keep radios in our backpacks for the kids. At like, okay, you got to be ready. Like, where are you going to be? Yeah. Turn on the radio, get on the little handheld thing and like click on, where are you? Those kind of stuff. But like, can you balance, if you live in one of these environments, like, can you balance the idea of just like, but you can still live a totally normal life?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any place in the world that you would say like, oh, you can't kind of live a totally normal life in that area?
No.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
Yeah, man.
Oh, okay. So I know the Richter scale goes in magnitudes, but I can't really quantify that in my head. So like, how much stronger is a 7 than a 6 or a 4 than a 3?
Right. First point, we don't really use the Richter scale anymore.
Oh, is that
just
not a thing?
As a matter of semantics? We use something that's like loosely based on the Richter scale called the moment magnitude scale. And it doesn't really matter. It's just sort of a interesting thing. It incorporates more information that we have now that Richter didn't have 100 years ago. So let's think about it in terms of spaghetti. I am a pasta fan. You pasta fan? Okay.
Yes.
Let's imagine that you have one strand of spaghetti. Okay. How hard is it to break that? Let's say that's a magnitude 5. All right. A magnitude 6 is 32 times larger. So that would be like taking a serving size of spaghetti and imagine breaking a serving size of spaghetti. A magnitude 7 would be 32 times larger than a magnitude 6. So that's 32 times 32, which is 1,024 strands of spaghetti, which is like this. That's several boxes full of spaghetti. Imagine trying to break that. All right. And then a magnitude 8 would be somewhere around 33,000 strands.
Oh, so it's like, it's not even the same world. Why do animals seem to know what's up? And I think that
yeah, I get that question a lot. There's always been a lot of interest in whether or not animals can predict earthquakes, and by and large, they cannot. What usually happens, so especially if you're kind of farther away from the earthquake, you'll feel the P wave first. That's the first wave that arrives, and it can be really subtle. So I think animals are more in tune with their environment and will recognize the P wave as being something outside of their sort of normal routine. And so they'll react. And then a few seconds later, you'll start to feel the shaking from the S waves. But the earthquake has already started where you are, right? The shaking has already been felt. And so it's just that we're not as attuned, or we may think, oh, that was a car driving by, or there's a branch falling on the roof or whatever, we just kind of ignore it. But the animals do not ignore it.
What do you think is the most for you? Like, what's the most interesting earthquake that's happened?
It's sort of a series of earthquakes that started several years ago. So, like, there was the Pala earthquake, and then recently the Myanmar earthquake. Those earthquakes were interesting because they were doing something that we didn't really realize earthquakes could do, which is go super shear. So it's almost like, the rocks are breaking, the zipper is unzipping, and as it's unzipping, the seismic waves are traveling out, and they travel at certain speeds. Occasionally, the actual breaking of the earth will get out in front of the seismic waves. It breaks faster than we think it should be able to break. It defies our expectations. And anytime something defies our expectations or is unusual, that's when we all go, ooh, what's happening here? Because that's an opportunity to learn more about the whole system, how the earth works, how earthquakes work. And so it's, those moments of what that I really love.
Do earthquakes ever happen in places that you don't expect them to happen? In the sense that, okay, like maybe there hasn't been one for 500 years or whatever in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but there is a history there. Like, is it ever just totally unexpected? Like, we don't know where that could have came from.
Yes. So, we have a good idea in broad strokes of how the earth works. And we know that most earthquakes happen around the boundaries of the tectonic plates. And so we're kind of always expecting earthquakes in those places. And we can see the GPS, we can see that there's fast plate motion, there's stress and strain building up, and we're like, okay, these are places that are likely to have earthquakes. But there is something called intraplate earthquakes, earthquakes that happen on the insides of tectonic plates away from the edges, like in the center of the US or along the East Coast. And the other thing about those earthquakes, if we're just, say, talking about the US, you have a lot of sand and silt, a lot of sediment has built up through time. And so often the faults aren't exposed at the surface. So we don't really know that they're there. We don't know where they are. And they don't have earthquakes very often because they're not building up stress and strain very quickly. And so when there are earthquakes in those places, they can take us by surprise. Additionally, the rocks on the East Coast and in the Midwest are kind of different than the rocks on the West Coast. And so earthquakes on the East Coast and Midwest are usually felt over about a 10 times broader area than earthquakes of the same size on the West Coast, just because those rocks are old, cold, and dense, so they transmit the seismic waves really well. So those earthquakes are always interesting, like the magnitude 5.8 in Mineral, Virginia in 2011. Who knew that was coming? Nobody. And everybody was like, what's happening? Like, what's going on? Because you just wouldn't expect it.
Was that the last time that you were kind of like, wait, where did this happen?
No, there was a magnitude, and now I can't remember, was it a 4.8, something like that in New Jersey? And I was at that time right outside of DC in Maryland, and I'm sitting, like reading budget report, doing something very dry, and I felt the
mundane
S wave arrive, and I was like, that was an earthquake. Oh my God, that was an earthquake. And then I felt the P wave arrive, and then I felt the S waves arrive. We're all looking around, and I was undignified. Like, I jumped up. I was like, that was an earthquake. Oh my gosh. But then I'm like, oh no. Because I know that there was a long time between the P wave and the S wave, which meant that the earthquake was pretty far away from me. And my first thought was, oh my God, that must have been a huge earthquake in the New Madrid seismic zone in Missouri. Like, hugely devastating. So I'm looking at the data, and I'm looking at seismometers around that area, and there was not really anything. So I'm like, where else? And I'm like, oh no, Charleston, South Carolina, because they had a huge earthquake in the 1800s that destroyed a lot of Charleston. So then I'm like, oh God, Charleston, my best friend lives in Charleston. So I'm looking, nothing. You could see the earthquake waves, but it clearly was not the earthquake source. And I'm like, where in the world did this earthquake happen? And I was like, I guess I'll look to the north. And it was in New Jersey. I was like, huh, I wasn't expecting that. Anywhere can be earthquake country.
Yeah, I would have thought that there was those places like, oh no, that just doesn't happen here. Like you're in the middle of the dinner plate, you're not falling off the edge, so to speak.
Exactly. I I've actually started doing a video series called Earthquakes in All 50 US States, just to point out that, like, most states have had earthquakes and they're really cool and interesting. And, it's kind of a curiosity. But it's also important for people that live outside of plate boundaries and expect earthquakes to be able to recognize them and know that that could be a problem. Because, on the East Coast, right, a 5.8 did a lot of damage because we don't build on the East Coast for earthquakes. People are not prepared, they don't know what to do. And so while their overall hazard from earthquakes may be low, they have pretty high risk when an earthquake happens because they're not prepared. And so, just making sure that people have that on their radar is something that they need to be aware of and know what to do when it happens, I think is really important.
Yeah, like I used to live in Kansas, and if a earthquake hit in Kansas, I'd be like, "What the hell was that?" I would have no idea what that
Well,
could have possibly been. But Kansas has had some big ones, I think.
so those are induced earthquakes. They're caused by people for the most part.
We can cause earthquakes. Is that fracking?
It's sort of fracking. So yeah, um, when companies that are looking for hydrocarbons, they can do the fracking, right, which is where they take water and a slurry of other material and they inject it into the ground, which breaks the rocks apart, which allows them to pull out whatever hydrocarbon they're trying to get out. But once that's gotten out, and that can cause small earthquakes, usually not very problematic or usually even felt. They pull that out, but then they have all this wastewater, the waste material that's not what they want. And so they will do something called injection. So very deep, deep down inside of the ground, beyond where aquifers may be or anything that really impacts us, they'll inject this water. The problem is sometimes that can kind of change the pressures down there or even lubricate faults, which can then cause earthquakes. And so it's this wastewater injection that tends to lead to these larger earthquakes in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, places like that.
I would not have thought that was something that we were capable of doing.
Well, and we can't get it twisted, right? Because it's not like we could cause earthquakes on the San Andreas so that we don't have a bigger earthquake. That's not really how it works. It's more we can accidentally cause earthquakes that can sometimes be of moderate magnitude.
Let me annoy you. How do you feel about the Yellowstone super volcano caldera thing? Is that real?
No, I mean, no. So, was it a super volcano at one time? Sure. Has it had a lot of really, really large eruptions throughout its millions and millions and millions of years? Yes. Is it something that I worry about now? Absolutely not. For a couple reasons. The magma chamber underneath there is not like large and active and ready to explode at any time, right? There's a high level of heat flow there, which is what causes all the beautiful geysers and the springs and the things that it's so well known for. It has a lot of earthquakes. It's in a tectonically active area, and there is a lot of hot water, fluid flow moving around under the surface. Is there the possibility of an eruption there? Sure. Would it destroy humanity? No. Also, Yellowstone is extremely well instrumented and really well studied. And so whenever anything is happening or changing there, you can check. The scientists put all the information out there. Everything is available to the public, so it's not like people are hiding anything. You can go and check. There are reports that go out all the time about what's happening at Yellowstone and, all of the other US volcanoes. So, no, I don't worry about I worry about a lot of things. Yellowstone is not one of them.
Is there a place like where people such as yourselves are like, oh, that's where we're all looking?
I flew into Seattle the other day.
I know.
And I was like, wow, Rainier is right there. And it is covered with snow. Again, Rainier is well instrumented. All of these volcanoes are well instrumented. And were there to be a change, people would know. It's most likely that we would be able to see changes in the volcano, both in its size and shape. And there's something called like volcanic earthquakes. So as magma and superheated gases are moving towards the surface, they cause the rocks to break and cracks to vibrate, and we detect those with seismometers. And so if those earthquakes start getting more and more shallow and closer to the surface, we can say, we got to do something. So it's not like it would really sneak up on us. So since we were talking about volcanoes, but in terms of earthquakes, I worry about Cascadia. I worry about a lot of the thrust faults underneath big population centers like LA, the Compton Thrust, the Puente Hills Thrust, and of course, the San Andreas, the Southern San Andreas, the Hayward in Northern California. Those are all faults that have earthquakes relatively geologically frequently, and they're near big population centers, and the earthquakes that they can have could cause significant amounts of damage. I worry a lot about the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey that runs underneath Istanbul, the Alpine Fault in New Zealand. There's a lot of faults in China that are helping to accommodate, India slamming into Eurasia. And there's a huge population centers, that are at risk from earthquakes on those kinds of faults. So,
do other planets have earthquakes?
They sort of. We don't call them earthquakes because they're not on Earth. We have moonquakes and we have Marsquakes that have been measured. So a few years ago, NASA put a seismometer on Mars. It was the NASA InSight mission, and they detected lots of different Marsquakes, including pretty large Marsquakes, the equivalent of like a magnitude 5. So they're caused by different things than we have on Earth because neither one of those have plate tectonics. And so what you're seeing is a lot of thermal expansion and contraction and, rocks breaking because of that. But
that's something that for some reason fascinates me. Is like, was there a discussion about like, wait a minute, we can't call it an earthquake if it's on Mars. We have to call it a Marsquake.
I mean, I'm sure there probably was.
I could just see that room.
It's really kind of interesting because, they didn't put the seismometer on Mars and go to all that trouble just to see if they were happening. You can use seismic waves almost like, you use like an ultrasound to look at a baby in somebody's belly. You can use seismic waves kind of the same way to look at the interiors of planets and understand how the planet is built, how it's put together. And that, if you're looking at the Earth compared to Mars, compared to the Moon, that tells us something about the evolution of the rocky bodies in the solar system. And so, it's all kind of connected to this bigger picture. How can we use science and data in ways to understand not just the one thing we're looking at, the Marsquake, the earthquake, the moonquake, but also larger things about planetary structure and the evolution of our solar system. And it kind of gets philosophical.
Best movie about earthquakes, worst movie about earthquakes, in the sense of that depicts what a big one would actually probably be like.
I don't know that I've ever really seen a good one about them. There's lots of bad ones. So San Andreas, really bad. 10.5, really bad. I would say San Andreas is one of the worst. Even in the trailer, there's a guy that goes, "We're talking about the Earth opening up. People would feel it all the way to the East Coast." And I'm like, wow, so many wrong things in one sentence. How did you manage?
But you can't go above it. Is the 10 even possible?
No. We don't have any. Remember the logarithmic scale, right? We don't have any faults on Earth that are long enough, deep enough, big enough to create a magnitude 10. The largest earthquake that's ever been recorded and is probably pretty close to the upper threshold is a 9.5. So there was a 9.5 earthquake in Chile, off the coast of Chile in 1960. That's about the limit. And I mean, for goodness sake, it doesn't need to be bigger. That was an enormous earthquake.
Is there anything you think that we missed, or where can people find you to learn more, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So to find me, I am Dr. Wendy Rocks across all social media, Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Find me there. I'm continuing to work on my Earthquakes in All 50 States videos, and I try and put out something after interesting earthquakes or large kind of international earthquakes to help people understand what happened and also what to expect, because earthquakes can be really scary. They happen without warning. And I don't want people to be afraid of the wrong things. Don't be scared, be prepared. It's important to take whatever fear you may have and turn it into agency, turn it into action, and do something that can be meaningful and manageable for you and your family and your community. So that's sort of my goals, how we can decrease our vulnerability and improve our resilience.